that my voice is so loud I don't even need a microphone. And it's nice to hear a nice kind of hubbub in the room after lunch as well. Normally we have lunch and everyone's energy levels kind of goes like this. And I always, I'm never very envious of the poor speaker that has to come on and fulfill the post-prandial slot. But happily for you, we've got someone who is lively enough and spirited enough and engaging enough to keep this conference going the way we want to. We've heard an awful lot about the black market. What does it mean? What is it? How can we tackle it? How does the industry position itself relative to the unregulated sector? And this is where we take a slightly deeper dive into what that is. We're going to have a panel, an excellent panel for you very shortly. But first of all, I'd like to welcome to the stage to give his presentation an economist specializing in regulated and illicit markets. His work analyzes the scale of unlicensed gambling, drivers of consumer migration, and implications for sustainable regulation. So please give a nice post-lunch welcome to Mark Johnson.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the big intro. I'll try not to disappoint. So I am Mark Johnson, and I'm here to talk to you about the work that Frontier Economics has done looking at the black market in the United Kingdom. This was work that we did on behalf of the Betting and Gaming Council, and this was work that was completed about a year ago, but I hope lots of the lessons from this still resonate today. I'm going to talk about three things in the next 20 minutes or so. The first is a bit of context to the black market in the UK and a bit of the history of how people have considered the black market in the UK. I'm then going to go on and outline some of the key insights from our report, and that's the why, the who, and the how players use the black market. And then I'm going to finish with a brief slide or two on what is the risks if the black market is allowed to thrive in the UK. So, where to start? I wanted to say first off that addressing the challenges of the black market is a common problem, and it is a common problem for operators in this room. It is a common problem for regulators in this room, and there's a shared interest in keeping as much gambling safe and visible as possible. And the UK has done a reasonably good job in this. So as many of you will be aware, the channelization rates in the UK are relatively low compared to lots of other European countries. And the purpose of this was not to get complacent. The purpose of this was to keep trying to understand the black market, to build on that strong position that the UK already has. I note that the Gambling Commission is also interested in research into the black market and has prioritized a set of studies to continue this and to continue to analyze and understand how people engage with the black market, which is very positive news. And so what's the reason to keep on top of all of this? It is because, as we've heard this morning, the black market continues to evolve. It continues to find new ways to appeal to target, and to retain all generations of players, but particularly young players, as we'll go on to talk about later. And they do this facilitated through technology. In this study, we looked at the impact of social media. We looked at the use of messaging platforms, as well as the more traditional routes of offshore websites. And the reason this is important is because there is a delicate balance that regulators need to find. And we have seen in other European jurisdictions that can be a very fine balance, and we want to maintain that strong progress in the UK. So, onto the study itself. The challenge in any study like this is to credibly measure and understand a behavior that is very, very hard to measure and very hard to capture. And so, to start, we put a lot of time and effort and thought into designing the survey and designing the methodological approach to get as much out of this as we could. And in practice, that meant starting not by asking people if they engaged in illegal activity online, because that is never going to work. It started with working up to the channels players used, and then looking at the operators that they used in those channels, and then only at the end introducing questions around their motivations and some of the reasons why they chose to gamble with operators who they thought may well be unregulated. The other part of this study was we worked quite closely with operators, and we worked closely with FDJ United, who we're very grateful for their help and participation in this study, as well as other major operators. And the reason we wanted to work with the operators was that so we could really understand some of the key player populations and really get down to the key behavior that we wanted to look at in this study. And in particular, what we wanted to do was we wanted to focus on the higher spending players. And so we deliberately oversampled that high spending group to really understand how they were engaging with the black market. And all this has allowed us to look at, as I said, the who, the how, and the why of black market awareness and usage in the UK. So, defining the black market was where we started with this piece of work. And there are shades of grey in some of this, but for our purposes, we defined the black market quite straightforwardly as sort of any gambling activity that was not regulated by the UK Gambling Commission. And as you see on the right, that actually takes many forms these days. It takes the form of traditional offshore websites and apps, but there are also new ways of betting with black markets that we were able to look at in this study. So that included crypto casinos, that included Telegram-based betting, and it included betting via social media groups as well. We did also look at land-based black market activity as part of this study, and I'll come on to some of the estimates of what that land-based black market activity looked like as well. So, how big is the black market? The graphic on the left shows 3 different groups of players in the UK. So this is gamblers who have been active in the last 12 months. And we looked at what proportion of that population were using black market online operators. That is the red box at the top. And that is about 5.6% of that gambling population were using those black market online operators that we named in our survey. We also looked at a couple of other groups that were overlapping with that population using black markets. We looked at social media or messaging platforms, people gambling on social media and messaging platforms, which added a further chunk to the proportion of players who were engaged with these less visible forms of gambling. We were able to track some VPN usage, and of course VPNs are not illegal, but we wanted to understand how VPN usage interacted with some of the black market channels that we were looking at in this work. And what we found is there was a correlation between players who used black market sites and their usage of VPNs. So overall, you may look at that graphic on the left and think that this is limited to relatively few players, and that, as I said at the start, the UK has done a relatively good job in controlling the size of the black market. But the numbers on the right are still very large, and the estimates that we ended up with in this study was that there could be 2.7 billion staked on online and messaging platform black markets in the UK. You add to this a potential 1.6 billion staked in person at non-licensed premises, and that gets you to over 4 billion potentially staked in black markets in the UK, which is about 3% of overall regulated spend in these markets. So not particularly high channelization rates, but the purpose of this study was not to come up with the biggest number possible. It was to understand the nature of play and the patterns of behavior in those black markets. So, the question I'll come on to next is why players choose to bet with unregulated gambling operators, unlicensed gambling operators. And what was interesting in this result was that it wasn't one factor that dominated the reasons why players chose to turn to black markets. There were two really distinct groups that both needed to work together to persuade players to come and play in black markets. So the first is some of the ability to avoid regulatory controls, and there are some examples in there of anonymity, more flexible payment options. They would include credit card spending, for example, and then avoiding deposit limits and avoiding providing documentation were, again, reasons that players said for choosing these types of operators. And then right at the bottom, slightly smaller percentage, but a concerning percentage is many players were choosing to avoid self-exclusion measures. But the reason I'm saying it's not one factor is these black market operators need to compete effectively with licensed operators. So you'll see right at the top there the need to offer better bonuses, to offer better odds, and to offer a wide range of games. They're all important reasons why players choose to play on these channels. On to who plays the black market. I've already said that there are 5.6% of people who are using at least one black market site. That's the red bar in the middle. What was striking, though, is when we looked at the age profile of players who were, first of all, aware of and also used black market sites, there was a very clear pattern, as you can see in this slide. So in particular, those aged 18 to 24 were 3 times more likely than the average population to be using those black market sites, and this reached 1 in 5 of the population when you add in gambling via social media or messaging platforms as well. So a real difference in the age profile of who is aware of and using these black market operators. And this points to the generational shift and the challenge that regulators will have going forward. These are players who are very well aware of these sites and are already using them far more extensively than the older groups as well. The second cut of the analysis that I wanted to highlight was the relationship between black market usage and spend. So again, you'll see a very clear relationship between the amount staked per month on overall by a player and the extent to which they are aware of and also use black market operators. So in a way, we shouldn't be surprised by this result. These are engaged players, they are savvy players, they are bombarded by lots of messages in this room. We've got a very engaged gambling audience. I'm sure you will also be aware through your social media feeds that there are lots of offers coming your way and lots of abilities to target players who've shown an interest in gambling. And so in a way, it's not that surprising, perhaps, that these bigger spenders are more exposed, more aware, and actually access those black market operators more. But it still points to quite a big risk factor given the concentration of spend amongst those higher depositing groups. So where I wanted to end is a final look at the different types of players and the different types of solutions that there are to limit the amount of black market play. So on the left, we've got a population which is most of the gambling population in the UK who only play with regulated sites. And that's the vast majority of players, and the challenge there is to continue to limit the exposure of those players to unlicensed sites and unlicensed options for them. Where I wanted to focus, though, is the middle group, which I've called the multi-homers. So many studies in the past have found that there are players who have a proportion of their spend with black market operators, and that's this middle group. And overall, it's 5.4% of the population, and as you can see, most of their spend does go with licensed operators. That's the 14.8 billion in this slide. They're spending extensively with licensed operators. However, they are the ones who have broken down the barriers of accessing black markets already. They're aware of, they are using, they're exposed to these options. And the risk for that group is for some of that 14.8 billion to move across to the other side. If the appeal of the licensed operators worsens, that is a big pot of money that is at risk and could potentially move across. So that's a really key group to focus on in regulation going forward. And then finally, on the right-hand side, these are players who use the black market only. That's a relatively small share of the population, but these are also the people who are most at risk, potentially, and who need protection and who need support. And the aim for a regulator is to limit the number of players who find themselves in that situation. So overall in this, I've painted quite a good picture of the UK. It's been very effective at limiting the channelization so far. But what I've hopefully shown you here is that the warning signs are there. It is a generational shift that is happening. It is the more engaged and the higher spending players who are most susceptible or most likely to engage with these black market operators. And for a lot of these players, they're already there. They've already opened the door to black markets, and the aim is to keep as much of that spend safe and visible as we can. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much. Mark Johnson, ladies and gentlemen. So to follow up Mark's excellent presentation and to talk a little bit about black market insights, I'd like to welcome to the stage the Executive Director at Frontier Economics, the company, of course, that Mark also represents, Richard Bradley. The Secretary General of EGBA, the former EU diplomat for consumer protection and now shaping EU-wide gambling standards and channelization policy, Maarten Haijer. Maarten, welcome. Partner at Regulus Partners and one of Europe's most respected voices on gambling regulation, policy analysis and harm prevention strategy, Dan Waugh. And Chair of the Dutch gambling regulator, Michel Groothuizen. Gentlemen, if you could come and join us on the stage, please. A big round of applause for our panel. Might be awaiting, yes, we are awaiting one more member of our panel.
Yeah.
You're here. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much. Richard, if I could start with you. Your study, as we heard there, quantified a market that many have spoken about anecdotally. I know the answer to this is probably everything, really, because it was your study. But if you were to take one headline out of that, if something struck you again listening, what was it? What resonated most?
Well, if I'm allowed to, I think the first is this project felt at times like you're trying to measure the unmeasurable, but you have to try. We heard this morning, black market is central to so many of the questions that we've got of player protection, of the commercial model, the tax that you get, and it's full of myths as well. They're trying to separate out the myths from the reality and put some numbers and put some grounding on measuring the unmeasurable is really, really important thing to do, and this was our attempt at doing that. So that's the first on sort of why it's important. And then I think in terms of the insights, as Mark says, in many ways the UK has a lot to be proud of. The channelization rates are pretty high in the legal market in the UK. But it's also pretty clear where the warning lights are flashing with younger players, with the bigger spends. That 14.8 billion of people who already use the black market but have most of their spend in the licensed part of the market as well. That's a lot that is on that tipping point, and I think those are the areas we have to be sort of laser focused over the next few years as these markets change really quickly as to what's happening and where that's going.
Maarten, can I pose the same question to you? Just your key takeaway there from the keynote.
I think the UK does fairly well, to be honest, compared to some of the other jurisdictions in Europe. The black market is growing in most jurisdictions at different rates, but I think the tendency is there. Both consumer demand is there, but also, I think also there's a lot of push from unregulated operators. So the problem is there, and it's very much growing, and the question is how to control it. And that, I think the morning presentation by Professor Aiken was worrying, but also insightful. I think big tech is part of the solution, but it should also be much more cooperation, preferably also between regulators to fight the unregulated offer in Europe.
Michel, you've been instrumental in helping establish the regulator in Holland in 2012. Just tell us exactly what really sharpened your focus. What drove and motivated you primarily?
Well, you make it a bit more difficult than I expected, but I'll have a try. Well, even since 21, that was when we opened up the market for online gambling. For the first 10 years, it was just the local market, so to say. What we have seen in the last few years is that, and it's quite comparable with the UK, as a matter of fact. The figures are more or less the same, relatively. We are a smaller country, of course. But what we see is that still about 90%, even perhaps even more than 90% of the people are gambling only legally, only to the licensed market. But half the money, perhaps even a bit more than half the money, is going to the black market. And that
so much higher staking bettors.
Yeah. And that has, well, different consequences. On the one hand, on the tech side, but that's not my first concern, but especially because we have, with the licensed operators, they become more and more compliant, so to say, and we are very glad about that they have a pretty high standard of duty of care obligations, and that they are, as said, compliant to it. Whereas in the black market, people are completely invisible and completely lost for us. And that's what is a big concern for me and for many others in the Netherlands.
Yeah. Dan, can I just ask you to add on this first point before we move on, in terms of what you felt was the headline there in the presentation?
Well, perhaps I'd preface by saying my first growing up job was with a company called Whitbread, and we were a hospitality company, and we were fascinated by what customers wanted. I think often in the gambling debate, people don't really focus on what consumers want. And my key finding, my key takeaway from the report was that you can group the motivations to play in the black market under 3 headings. One is value, 2 is ease and convenience, and the 3rd is freedom and choice. So what it's telling me is that for some customers, the black market offers a better quality experience than they can get in the regulated market, or at least that's their perception. And that should be really concerning. It does sort of suggest that perhaps the state is letting people down by not allowing them to get the experience that they're after. And I think that's the point. We can talk about enforcement and all these things, but if ultimately people are getting a better experience in the unregulated market, that should be a cause for concern.
And can you then ever, Richard, affect a situation whereby you have a regulated market which is sufficiently robust, but equally sufficiently frictionless to present an attractive alternative to what is unregulated? Is it ever possible?
Well, I think that's the line we have to stay the right side of. That, as Dan says, customers will choose. There is no point in us creating a world in which customers choose to go elsewhere in the world that is unlicensed. And I think understanding how far we can push, how far those choices can go, how far we can stretch before people move, and the habits that create. Professor Aitken's speech this morning was fascinating in terms of thinking about the behavioural drivers that have started years before people start engaging with gambling, and that's the world in which we need to be preparing for today.
And that surely then, before I move on, that surely then presupposes that you need to do much more collaborative work with institutions from outside the sector, to big tech companies and gaming companies and people who are affecting or adversely affecting, you might say, the behaviour of 8 to 14-year-olds.
I think it's both. It has to be within the sector. Clearly, player protection has a big role to play for everybody here. So it's finding the least friction ways, the best ways of building up the habits in ways that sort of lead to safer gambling within the sector, and address all the other drivers of behaviour elsewhere as well. All the other participants, social media companies, much more wide, the wider supply chain as well that often operates between the licensed and the unlicensed sectors.
But that second sector is an area of greater potential, isn't it? There are fewer bases covered there as things stand.
I think yes. The focus very much is on the licensed players. The focus also often is on, we tend to regulate products, and we're trying to protect customers. And in that gap between products and customers, I think there's a lot of insight gaps there as to what it is that leads to the harm, and how that links to play, and where that goes. And I think there's institutional gaps as well as to how we go beyond the licensed players to the wider ecosystem that we heard a lot about this morning.
Talk a little bit about the new technologies. We've heard quite a lot about AI for good and for less good earlier today. Maarten, how are those new technologies changing the threat landscape? How are they driving more people away from where you want them to be?
I don't think it's even that sophisticated, to be perfectly honest. I think without new technology, the black market is still growing. I mean, obviously, crypto has a huge role to play, that's for sure. But you don't necessarily need to have VPNs to go onto black market websites or AI to go there. I think AI does enable the black market operators to target advertising and all those very specific bonuses and what have you. So I think it enables operators that are not regulated to do an even better job. For us, the solution is not so much to completely eradicate the black market, but because I really think it's impossible, but to cause much more friction than there is now. So maybe less friction on the side of the regulated, but much more friction on the side of the unregulated websites. And for that, I think it's really important that we get support from big tech, one way or the other, crucial, and also support from regulators, although I think regulators do that without our questioning as well, but I think there should be more done there on that end as well. And then, I mean, that's maybe a bit more on how do you get results as an industry. It's good that we sit here together in a meeting room and agree that the black market is a big problem. But if we go out with the message, please regulate us a bit less or find the right balance, the average legislator, has no credibility in the online gambling industry. And us to come out and say, please regulate us less, will only harm us. So I think we also need to do a better job as an industry, not just to agree in this room, but also to better explain that, yes, we embrace regulation, we welcome KYC, we welcome minor protection rules, but there needs to be something done about the friction that is now on our side and the lack of friction that's on the side of the black market.
Do we have to give so much ground, do you think, Dan?
I don't think it's about giving ground, because that implies there's a sense of appeasement or politics going on here. Really what we should be focusing on what is right for the consumer. I think what we see, and apologies Michael, I'm talking purely in a UK context here, but there have been so many changes to regulation over the past decade. I think I'm right in saying this, in not a single consultation from the Gambling Commission has it explored what are the unintended consequences here. The idea that over-regulation might push some customers into illegal operators is not even discussed. And so I think that has to be part of the process of thinking about regulation. What are the consequences here? And also, we can't carry on just layering on regulation. There has to be a sense that if you bring in some regulations, maybe there's other regulations that can be eased off. But at the moment, it's just a constant layering on of regulation. And I think ultimately, I mean, what I would say is that for probably a decade or more after the passing of the Gambling Act, there was a catastrophic failure of customer service in the online gambling industry in Great Britain and probably in other jurisdictions. But the response from regulation has been to treat the customer just as badly. You know, there's no respect for the customer here, either from the operators or from the regulator, and I think that causes a pretty dire situation.
And Michel, how do we strike that balance? You can presumably identify with what Dan's saying. Strong regulation is one thing, over-regulation is another thing, regulation that drives customers away from the sector is another thing altogether.
Yeah, this is a pretty difficult dilemma in a way. For what I see is that, at least in my country, but I fear that might be in other countries as well, that the primary reaction of politicians is to make regulation stronger. And we, up to a certain level, I sometimes I'm being seen as a kind of, helper of the industry, so to say, when I'm trying to explain that the more we make it, the higher we make the taxes, the higher we make our regulation, the more difficult we make it for our operators, the big winner is the black market. We do see that, but it's pretty hard to bring that closer together. And then one of the disadvantages of this industry is that it's a rather niche industry. It's not a very popular one. Well, popular among players, but not among politicians and among, still the majority of the Dutch at least don't gamble. Well, buying lots in the lottery, but that's it. And so politicians don't realize what's going on, and that everyone, all young people see advertisement for gambling and have opportunities on their social media. Give you an example. About 5 million, we have 18 million in the Netherlands, inhabitants, about 5 million people below 25 on TikTok.
Yeah.
I have to, I'm not allowed to be on TikTok myself. Well, not me, but we as a regulator. It's very hard for.
So you're not actually allowed your own social media account.
We probably will, nevertheless. But it's just to give you an idea that we have to fight this market with our hands bound, so to say. It's not something that we. I'm not allowed to use DDoS attacks or something like that. Of course, we are government. We are a kind of government, at least. We are an independent body whatsoever. But anyway, we regulators belong to the governmental side. So we are bound by a lot of rules, and that's very good, and it should be like that. But on the other hand, we are confronted with a market that is growing and developing very, very fast, and the technological gap between us and the market, and especially the black market, is widening instead of being able for us to bridge it.
So, Dan, moving on to future regulation then, what does an optimal regulatory landscape look like?
I probably repeat myself here, but I think it has to be customer focused. And when I say customer focused, the customer in general, rather than simply, rather than the harmed customer, for example. So we have to have a regulatory regime that reflects that. I think also we have to have a more honest debate about this. I think black market is used as a bit of political football. You've got one side saying, oh my God, the sky's falling in. The other side saying, oh, black market, what black market? I think in terms of regulation, there has to be and actually no, from all sides, I think there's got to be an acceptance of fallibility. And from a regulatory perspective, I think it needs to look at some of the regulations and say, look, we put these things in with the best of intentions. Have they worked? Have we evaluated them? And be prepared to say, well, no, they haven't, and maybe we need to think again. So I think that, like anything, a greater openness, greater honesty, greater sort of, willingness to admit error would lead to a better outcome. And also, the other thing, operators are proximate to the customer. If you want to understand what's going on with the customer, the operators are the best people to ask. So greater on a collaboration theme, greater collaboration between regulator and operators should deliver greater insights about what the customer wants and what motivates the customer.
And why do you think we as a sector have failed to convince the governments that actually they can have both and? They can have what they're owed by the operators and they can have more if they actually properly attack the black market?
I think it's because...
Is it because the operators have been using the black market as a political football and the governments just will not accept the fact that the threat is real?
I think to an awful lot of people it will come across as self-interested.
Yeah.
You're talking about the black market because as a reason not to take appropriate steps to protect the well-being of your own customers. So, I think this has to, the black market conversation is important, but I think the industry is massively over-reliant on it. And to really it needs to be put into a context. We go, we are looking after the well-being of our customers. We are taking this seriously. We're accepting or owning the issues that can arise, and we're dealing with those sensibly. And if you do that, then I think you earn the right to have a sensible discussion about black market.
Richard, you're nodding away there.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think if you over-rely on the risk of the black market, as the industry has done at times, then people stop listening. It becomes the boy who cried wolf. But the point is, to an extent, the wolf did come in the end. So there is a genuine risk there that we need to find the dialogue, find the evidence, find the truth that sits behind it as a way of being able to move on.
Going back to a point that Mary was making earlier on, she was saying that the industry needs to provide evidence to government that this exists and get them to actually do something about it rather than just keep saying the black market, the black market, the black market.
Yeah.
Is that a reasonable contention? Is that actually possible?
Well, it goes back to trying to measure the unmeasurable. And I think, so as an economist, it's fascinating trying to get your arms around this and work out where it is. I think our work was about how big is the black market and a little bit about where it is. But we heard this morning again the pace at which it's changing, the number of different dimensions. I mean, Professor Aitken's talk was brilliant about describing the wider landscape in which it sits. And I think we don't know nearly enough about the routes that customers take in the licensed operators with the black market, how that's different for different people, and bring it back ultimately, which is what we want, to a customer view of why do people choose to do what they do. I think we have quite blunt tools at the moment, and there's a lot, I think, both for the operators and for the regulators to invest in and learn on that. Not least because it's going to change again in the next few years.
Maarten, what's your take on that?
I agree. I think the issue is we can do more black market studies and come up with a more specific figure and have another one. I don't think that will really change the Dow in the discussion. There needs to be a willingness to act upon the facts that are there, irrespective of whether it's 13, 15 or 50% black market. I think we should also acknowledge and understand that regulation is very going very much into human behavior in our sector compared to any other sector. What is really trying to achieve with regulation is to have really influence and impact the behavior of people online. That's incomparable to any other sector, which is, whether we like it or not, probably the way it is going anyway. But it does require, at the same time, an acknowledgement that regulation can only go so far, and there needs to be more trust and understanding of what actually works online, and therefore you need to have more cooperation between an operator who sees what works and a regulator that is required, or a legislator, to have these more intrusive measures in place. So rather than having horizontal regulation for very specific online behavior, which happens in no other sector, which we probably can't get rid of, whether it's desirable or not, I think to be able to influence people to that extent and such individual behavior, we need to step away from the idea that one horizontal rule will help, but rather go to results-oriented policies, have some confidence and trust over the year, a good dialogue between the regulator and operator. Okay, what does work? Show me the evidence. And you can change your policy rather than having these relatively, let's put it diplomatically, horizontal, ineffective measures that we have evidence. Take the Netherlands, deposit limits, the effect is a larger chunk of the revenue now goes to the black market than to the regulated markets. So we know some of the things that work and don't work. We don't really know what works, but if we want to really impact people's behavior, I think we need to have more trust based on policy rather than regulation.
Just reflecting over the last couple of decades from your perspective, Michel, what's worked best and what's worked least well from a regulatory standpoint? If you had your time again, if you could go back again and say,
Well, what I've learned from our past, so to say, is that imposing fines works pretty well in the licensed market, but not at all in the black market.
No.
We just don't get the money, and they're probably just laughing at us. But what could help, and that's what we're trying now, together with the industry, as a matter of fact, is to disconnect in a way the black market operators from their clients by making it more difficult to pay, using therefore our banks and payment service providers and that kind of institutions, which is a pretty uphill battle as well, for they are not really waiting for us, so to say. Another field is along the line of the tech companies, the Metas, the Googles, which is, pretty difficult as well. But nevertheless, if it's harder to find the black operators, the illegal operators, that might help. And fighting influencers and advertisers in the Netherlands, or Europe-wide or worldwide, but anyway, from our perspective in the Netherlands. And that's what we are doing now, more and more, hoping that that will be more impactful than imposing fines. And, I'm very glad that we are supported by this approach by at least the licensed operators in the Netherlands. Some are only, applauding, others are really helping us in actions and warning us about what's going on. So I'm really quite satisfied about this new road, although I can't give real results yet.
But if this result is a more positive one in the fullness of time, Dan, as we look to draw this to a conclusion, is that going to mean that for the regulated sector, there's going to be a better balance between protection of customers and freedom of choice, or are we too far over the hill?
I'm normally a fairly dismal and gloomy person, but I like to be optimistic on occasion, if only to surprise people. So I think that, 10 years ago we weren't in this space in Britain. I do think there's an opportunity to get back to a more balanced discussion in general about gambling regulation. We've ended up in a very skewed, very distorted position, particularly with public health driving a sort of an agenda that says, really you shouldn't gamble at all. So I think because in my time in the gambling market, in a relatively short period of time, things have moved so far in one direction. I think the pendulum can swing back. I'm optimistic about that. I just don't know how long it will take.
We've got a little bit of time. Would anyone like to ask any of the panel a question, or I throw a question back to Mark? Yes, table 9 here. Can we rustle up a mic, please? Can we have a mic at table 9? Here's one coming. I can see trotting towards the table. There we go. Yes, sorry.
Hello. I was wondering if you could maybe touch a little on the differences between different jurisdictions within EU, that we don't have one regulator on top of EU, like we did with AML, right? That, banks are under the same directive, and I think that helps. And I think gambling now is more, at least European, worldwide activity. So I wonder how the different regulators in Netherlands, in Spain, how they can work together and how European Union can help them to actually tackle some of these issues. And maybe this could be a way to.
So a pan-European gambling regulator, like an AML regulator. We allowed to join in Britain still, or we, no?
They're out.
Sadly not.
No.
How do you want to tackle that, Maarten?
No, I think cooperation needs to be there, and in the whole of Europe. I mean, if EU regulation allows for even closer cooperation, that's great. But I think it's not just a EU problem. I think there's no real appetite at the moment for harmonization in Europe, in the EU. But there's a real necessity for more closer cooperation between regulators, that's for sure, because it's such a wide problem that each individual regulator in itself will find it very difficult to deal with, big tech, extra overseas territories, what have you. So, absolutely, I would say, absolutely necessary. A pan-European one, it's a far-fetched, but more close cooperation, I think, would be really ideal and necessary.
Does that not apply beyond European borders as well? And given the fact that the policies in the United States and policies in the EU, for example, are likely to diverge quite significantly, if we're to reach some sort of consensus on this, doesn't it require collaboration beyond European borders?
I think it does, but it requires a common vision,
common
of
purpose.
goal.
Sorry.
And I think that doesn't exist. I think different jurisdictions, different jurisdictions will have different ambitions for their gambling market. I mean, going back to the pan-European thing, God, this was being talked about 15 years ago, and I think the industry at one point was very enthusiastic about this because it thought that it would get simplicity and it reduce compliance costs. But also that was based on the idea that it would be a pan-European system that was sort of amenable to the industry. I think nowadays there'd be far less appetite because the pendulum is swinging so far away from what the industry wants. That the idea that you take what's happening in Spain and impose it across all European jurisdictions, that would not find favour, I think, with a lot of operators.
What would your members think to that, Michel?
Well, later onwards you have Anders Dorf here, and he is the chairman of the European Association of Regulators, so to say. So you might ask him as well. But I'm very much in favor of closer collaboration as well within the European Union. But honestly, we have put only baby steps thus far, and much more is needed. Moreover, one of our best partners in the field of regulators is the UK. We had a comparison earlier this year, and it turned out that of the 20 biggest black operators in the UK, 6 of them belong to the 10 biggest ones in the Netherlands. So it's a market that is not only Dutch, it's everywhere. And it helps if we can work together. So I'm very much in favor of being able to use the data, not only the data, but also the investigations that my colleagues in Birmingham have done, so that we could use them in our courts as well, or wherever, and vice versa, of course. So there is more possible than along the line of, here Brussels, the European Union. That's important, but a lot of bilateral collaboration can help us as well. And it's regrettably a domain where international collaboration is very, very limited.
Thank you so much. We are out of time for this panel. Thank you for listening so attentively, but more importantly, thank you to our panel for some wonderful contributions. Richard Bradley, Dan Waugh, Maarten Haijer, and Michel Groothuizen, thank you all very much indeed. So on we go to our next presentation and our next panel, and our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is part of FDJ United Senior Project in the Group Strategy team. And he is going to talk to you about customer insights. So please give a warm welcome to FDJ United, Sam Ross.
Thank you very much, Nick. Is there a bit of feedback? Yeah, great. And hello, everyone. My name is Sam Ross. As Nick mentioned, I work in the group strategy team at FDJ United, but I'm here to speak today in my old capacity as head of customer experience at FDJ United. And in that capacity, a lot of what we do is keeping our finger on the pulse of our customers through interviews directly with customers and surveys, both with our customers and online gamblers in general, on their experiences broadly, but very specific to this conference. Black market, their perceptions of the black market, why do they play on the black market, etc. And my goal with this presentation is really to bring the player into the room with us through insights, anecdotes that we've learned from customers over the years. And I think a lot of it actually will echo very nicely with what Mark presented on and this previous panel, and hopefully will segue quite nicely into the next panel as well. But I think the first point to make, and it's been made a few times already today, is that the line between legal and illegal gambling has never been thinner. We've seen recent news and reporting out of the Netherlands and France that, from a revenue perspective, unlicensed markets are starting to outweigh, in some cases, or outgrow the licensed markets. And my job here isn't to scope the black market, but we have seen a growing number of gamblers across the UK, Sweden, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands that are playing now with at least one unlicensed operator in the last year. But I think the more important question that I want to cover today is why? Are players ignoring risk? Do they simply not care? Or can they not, in fact, tell the difference in some cases, the type of environment that they're playing in? So the first point to make, I think, is that players on the whole want to play in safe, regulated environments. When we ask online gamblers what impacts their trust in an operator's experience, we see approval from the regulators and having that established brand that's been around for a long time as two of the top four factors impacting trust. But the irony is, when we filter that same data, isolating black market players, 39% of them still say regulator approval is a key trust signal for them. And 1 in 5 who told us they've played on a black market site note their perception of that brand as licensed as one of the main reasons that they play on that site. So we have an ironic juxtaposition, so to speak. Some subset of players wanting to do the right thing, understanding the importance of playing on a safe, regulated environment, but perhaps not feeling empowered to do so. And when you look around, it's not difficult to understand why. The UX gap in many cases between unlicensed and licensed experiences is closing. Mainstream sponsorships across sports and otherwise continue to add legitimacy to black market operations. And we're seeing, we touched on, I think earlier, Gen Z and streaming and these sorts of things, continuing to blur that line between licensed and unlicensed perception. And in fact, our research does show that 13% of black market players have chosen to play on an unlicensed site, thanks, at least in part, to sponsorship and advertising. And when we asked customers, online gamblers across all of these markets, to categorize the brands they play into two buckets, players were only 7% more likely to associate unlicensed operators with the qualities of a black market operator than licensed operators. And when we speak directly to customers as well, this point really comes through. As part of a series of customer interviews that we've conducted over the last year in the UK, a common reaction when probing black market topics wasn't too dissimilar to this man that we can see on the screen. Shock, a bit of distress to find out that they have been playing, in some cases, on black market operators. And one of those customers ended their interview and asked me, well, Sam, how do I spot the difference? And how do I know the type of environment that I'm playing in? And despite working my whole career in gambling, I didn't quite have a simple answer for them. But I think it's incumbent, and we've heard it a couple times already, but incumbent on, I think, regulators and licensed operators to work together on a system, signal, campaign, something that empowers our customers and lets them know the type of environment and the type of operator that they're playing with. Because otherwise, experientially, unlicensed operators entice. And what we see in the data is that they entice and over-index compared to licensed operators in three specific areas. One of those is fewer restrictive RG tools, better bonuses, and fewer play disruptions. But remember, these are the same players who told us they value playing in regulated, safe environments. So these aren't players who are seeking out risk, necessarily. It's just that licensed experiences oftentimes just feel harder. And we actually had an analogy from one of the customers that we interviewed that talked about car rental. Let's say you have company A who allows you to drive the car right off the lot, pay later, and you have company B that wants your full accident history and wants you to pay up front to understand that you can afford to pay for the type of car that you chose to rent. So they told us, as a customer, I'm going to put my trust in the company that's putting their trust in me. And there's kind of this idea that more seamlessness in the customer's eyes equals more trust. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to tackle here. Because in essence, the very journeys that we're building to instill trust in our sites oftentimes end up turning customers away and making them feel that we don't trust them. And we can see this is our own internal data when we look across our customer journeys. Our affordability journeys have the lowest customer satisfaction scores of any of our journeys at 48%. And as operators, we need to deliver these very necessary compliance journeys in an empathetic way that makes customers not feel criminalized or policed. But all hope is not lost. We do see some positive signs in the data as well. You might remember from the earlier chart that security, speed, ease of payments, deposits and withdrawals was the #2 biggest factor of trust for players. but it's also the #1 area that black market operators underperform in compared to licensed operators when players were asked their reason for playing on that site. So in other words, licensed operators are perceived as more secure payment environments. And the other area that we see black market players or operators underperforming in was UX and content. But I think Michel alluded to it a bit, and a couple others on the panel. That's an area that we've started to see regulators trying to say, chop unlicensed operators at the root when it comes to the experience that they're allowed or able to offer to customers, working with payment providers, working with game suppliers, to ensure that the unlicensed experience is subpar compared to the licensed experience. And at least the data that we're seeing backs those up as smart policies. So in conclusion, what can operators and regulators learn from the players? So we've seen one, that lots of players are using black market sites aren't empowered to make informed decisions about where they play. How do we collectively fix that? Understand that regulation positioned to build trust may well be doing the opposite. So how do we protect and not police players and deliver those experiences in an effective way? And payment security and UX and content are two of those areas that licensed operators have a perception edge over unlicensed operators. How do we communicate, say, the risk of the unlicensed environment from a payment perspective effectively to customers and really get that message home that these aren't totally safe, in some cases, environments that they are playing in. So I've posed some questions there, but I'll leave it to the brilliant minds on the next panel to start to dive into that in a little bit more detail. But thank you very much.
Sam, thank you very much. Sam Ross, ladies and gentlemen.